thank you for inviting me to speak today. So it is about IT, which can be a hard sell, so I'll do my very best to make it as interesting and engaging as possible. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name's Nikki. I am one of 2 laboratory incident specialists with the SHOT team. So my background is I was a BMS from 2000, which is a long time ago. Oh, I'm sorry, it's automatically moving on. Working all the way up to transfusion lab manager, and then I started with the SHOT team about 18 months ago. So I'm not a TP by background, but I did work very closely with our fantastic TP teams. So hopefully I can give you some insight from my perspective. Okay, so to start, I'm going to look at a positive slide. So there's an awful lot of benefits and transfusion using IT to do with transfusion safety. Obviously, I'm from SHOT, so I am going to talk about where things maybe haven't gone so well, but I wanted to try and start with a positive one. So there's a huge amount of benefits for IT and transfusion safety. I'm sure most people have used some or all of these aspects, all the way from requesting things on an EPR system where there's rules and algorithms built in, all the way through to issuing, collection and administration, and everywhere in between. Like that leads into what Matt was just talking about as well, about stock management and things like that, and that interoperability between the 2 systems. So absolutely, the use of IT prevents an awful lot of errors in the transfusion process, the whole pathway. But on the other side of things, obviously we've got upgrades and difficulties with implementation and setup and validation. Having an IT expert or having IT support can sometimes be difficult, and particularly that ongoing training. So sorry, I accidentally muted myself. With those comes the opportunities for different types of errors. We absolutely have 2 sides of our balance. So IT can solve some problems, but sometimes it can create other ones along the way. Okay, so errors related to IT. So SHOT has been around for just over 25 years now, and it started looking at IT in particular back in 2007, obviously as IT increased in the hospitals and out there in organisations. So it only specifically looked at where there'd been incorrect blood components transfused. So that includes where specific requirements weren't met or the wrong component had been transfused. And then obviously as time has gone on, it moved on into a few years later, 2011, began to look at all of our categories. So everywhere in all of our reports, we would look, has there been an aspect of IT involved in this case? So back in 2007, we only had 25 reports that were related to IT. And then in our most recent report, which was from last year, we had 374. So obviously you can see IT has been increase in use. So that with that comes an increase in errors. Okay, so over the years, looking at those different reports, what kind of recommendations did SHOT try and make? And sadly, they're the same kind of recommendations every year. Sometimes they might slightly change and move to the side, but it tended to include things like making sure you use warning flags, make sure you've got really good validation and implementation, that you use IT at critical points in the process, that where possible you upgrade your limbs. To obviously the more recent the upgrade, hopefully that would resolve any previous problems. On the other side of the coin, we do see reports of over-reliance on IT, which we will go on to talk about later on. Making sure that there's good interoperability, so that if you've got multiple IT systems, that wherever possible you try and get them to talk to each other. And if you've got a system downtime, because unfortunately IT will fail as it usually does on a Friday before a bank holiday, that you've got a process in place for downtimes, that you use wherever possible those algorithms and the rules to make those decisions that me as a human might make the wrong decision, that IT would take that decision away from me, and that staff are sufficiently trained to understand the IT that's in place. Okay, so when we looked at recurrent IT issues that had been reported, a lot of them were related to LIMS alerts and flags. So either the the flag was not added, or it wasn't listened to by the BMS, or it might not have been heeded by the patient's bedside as well. With IT tended to come alert fatigue. So we've asked you to put these alerts in. You've asked your LIMS systems to put these alerts in, but there are so many alerts, people are just escaping or returning through those, and they just don't see the wood for the trees. An inappropriate override of those alerts, so they come hand in hand. And then LIMS algorithms for safe transfusion. So there were issues with component compatibility, so maybe the compatibility rules hadn't been set up right. There were issues with sample validity, samples that had expired were being used, and there were issues around electronic issue of red cells as well. And there was that lack of end-to-end transfusion, IT and transfusion. Okay, so what did SHOT try and do about that? So back in 2019, a time before COVID, it got together and it created the script working group. So that is the SHOT. There won't be a test on the end. SHOT UK Collaborative Reviewing and Reforming IT Processes in Transfusion. So effectively, it's a group of multiple different people, different backgrounds, different representations from different groups, and we get together on a monthly basis and we try and resolve some issues that we've seen. So it started back in 2019 due to the increase in IT errors that they were seeing, and it's made up mainly of lab managers, representatives from throughout the different UK regions. We've got SHOT team members, we've got SHOT IT and lab chapter writers, and people from the blood service. We have people from the MBTC as well. So we just try and make sure that all of our activities are aligned and we don't overlap with anybody else. We're not stepping on anyone's toes, and we are helping to promote the use of IT. So one of the first things they did was back in 2020, they created a SHOT reporter survey. So anybody who reports to SHOT, they ask them a multitude of questions, which we'll go on to chat about in a minute. And then following on from that, they sent out in 2021 a LIMS supplier survey. So this went out to all the LIMS suppliers. And then we've got next steps, which we'll talk about as well. So that includes following on from the results we received in the 2 surveys, hopefully workshops, IT resources and IT educational material as well. Okay, so the processes that the script group are going through. So we've got stakeholder engagement. So we're talking to reporters, talking to providers, trying to identify that if there's any gaps and understanding maybe if there are any barriers people are facing, any difficulties in communication between the two, between the reporters and between the suppliers as well. We're hoping to bring everybody together, and from that develop some toolkits and FAQs, which we'll go on and talk about what's already available, which we're hoping to build upon. And it's all with the intention of trying to promote improvement in safety and transfusion, having an end-to-end transfusion IT. Okay, so when we sent out the user survey, so this went out to all reporters, SHOT reporters, concerns that people have were to do with LIMS upgrades. So either there was a lack of functionality within the system, but TLMs and TPs felt that there was pressures to difficulties in upgrading, so there were lack of opportunities to upgrade. Either that they thought that was to do with financial impact, or they just didn't have the staff and the time to do those things. There was a lack of knowledge of other systems within the hospital. So there's obviously I've been at 20 years in a lab. There's an awful lot of IT systems working out there, and it's just everybody seemed to work in silo. That was the responses from the survey, that there was a lack of knowledge of where they could link up with other systems and how they could make that better. Challenges with implementing other IT systems, again, trying to get the trust engaged, trying to get that financial support and the IT expert support as well. Supplier support, from personal experience as well, it was trying to make sure that people complied with UK standards, making sure that you had some sort of support from the supplier, and that was definitely a concern for our when we looked through the survey. A lack of transfusion IT experts training and allocated time. So absolutely not having sufficient staff involved to help with things that we've just talked about. So the upgrades, the training, the implementation, that conversations with the suppliers. You absolutely need that IT expert, and you need that allocated time. And that's difficult when everyone is already maxed out. And the final one from the user survey was that reporters felt that there was a need for national guidance and templates, which we are trying to do, which I will come on to in a moment as well. Okay, so then a year later, we asked the LIMS suppliers, following on from some of the questions and concerns that people had in the first survey. We asked about functionality rules and algorithms. So we asked about things like ABO incompatibility issues, emergency issuing, specific requirements, things like irradiated and KNEG, and sample validity. So there was actually, the response was that from the suppliers was that they could do a lot of those things, but it's whether you can implement that within your hospital due to the concerns we had on the previous page, staffing and IT experts. The next one was interoperability between the two systems. Again, we asked the suppliers, can you link to, and we gave them a variety of options, things like trackers, analyzers, EPR systems if your limb stands alone, temperature monitoring systems. And again, their responses did say that there was good processes for interoperability. Again, it's just whether that's able to be implemented within the hospital, having that time and the financial help as well. Data extraction and audit. So we asked, can you extract data from your system, and can we use that in an audit trail? The responses were that you could configure the reports, but I actually, when we looked through it, it's probably not in the best format, and whether it's usable to me as a TLM or use it if it's usable for the TPs, that was another concern. So LIMS upgrades. Obviously, when we asked the reporters what were your concerns about upgrades, they'd mentioned things like financial aspect, but the responses from the suppliers were, most of them were free, but obviously, so there were no cost implications, but it's just the cost of the people's time to implement it. Anti-D management. So there were a few suppliers that had logic rules that would reduce the potential for issuing anti-D inappropriately to the wrong group of patients, but there was a general lack of control around that. So that's definitely something we'd like to push forward with the suppliers. And finally, communication. So I think looking at the two surveys from the reporter and from the supplier, you could see that there was definitely a disparity between the two. And so I think that's one of the things SHOT would really like to do, to try and open those lines of communication and hopefully iron out some of those problems. There is a whole dedicated page on the SHOT website for scripts, so we put everything on there, and you just need to go to resources, and in there will be the script page. If you can't find it at all, absolutely please do come back to us and I can send you the link. In fact, I'll put the link in at the end as well. And there's a QR code if you wanted to go, just not yet. Some of the things that are already on there, we've got the two surveys, we've got all the responses, they're available on the website. This is obviously, you can't read these are tiny, but you can go to the website and see them. We've also got a survey to do with electronic blood management systems. We've got documents on there, for example, to do with anti-D management, so where we're trying to encourage at different points during the pregnancy, or at different points during the system, could you implement IT to try and improve transfusion safety? So that's a few of those. We've also got a script IT toolkit. This is with the intention that this will absolutely grow. So these are documents that we've had from lab managers and TPs, and at the moment we've got things like LIMS specifications and EPR specs as well, and we've also got validation documents. So these are freely available. They're completely anonymous. You can take them, you can use them, make them your own. That's absolutely fine, even if it was just a a signpost of somewhere to start if you are about to start that process. We've also got things on there where we've given presentations before. So if you were particularly interested in other cases that have happened and other presentations we've given, but you can go onto the shop website and it's all there for you. So the script group, what are the next step with the script group? So we're hoping to have a user group where we get users and suppliers in the same room, and we can detail what we want, what the future needs are, what the next steps are, and how to improve practice. We're hoping to develop a community of practice and a body of transfusion IT experts. So we are looking at educational materials. We're looking at some e-learning, just to try and improve that standard of expert IT knowledge out there. And we're hoping to develop the IT toolkit. I know, having been through a whole new EPR system, it would have been nice when we went through it to have somewhere to go to, even if it just pointed me in the right direction and gave me something to consider to make sure I thought of as many things as I possibly could. So anybody, so following on from that, how can you get involved? If you've got anything that you feel helped you when you implemented anything to do with IT, then we would absolutely love to see that from you. You can, even if it was like lessons learned, things I wish I knew, anything along those lines would be brilliant. You could absolutely take part in the workshops. When I think we're hoping for them to be in spring next year. So that's, if you'd like to be involved, please do let us know. And any future work by script, if it's something that you particularly are interested in, please do come forward, and we'd love to hear from you. So the next half of my presentation is going to talk about some IT related shop reported cases. So just to terrify everybody, here's your Sabre login. So we're going to talk about some cases. So one of the things that we look at, so you as a reporter, you'd fill in your shop reported case. It would go to Sabre, obviously. Some will come to shop, some will go to MHRA, and some will go to both. And then what we do is we would look at each of those cases and we will ask ourselves, was IT involved in this? So we might ask a multitude of things. Was the error caused or contributed by the IT? Was it caused by IT systems being used incorrectly? Or could IT have been a solution that could have prevented it? So the question on our first question is, was IT involved? IT might not have been involved, but it could have been, it may have been available and should have been used or could have been used. I will still select yes, and then we'll go on to look at that, because that's absolutely certainly part of the same story. And then again, we will look at if at any point a corrective or preventative action included an IT as a solution, then we would want to see that one as well. So that's something we look at, and we look at that for every single case. So this is a bit of a fuzzy snip from the last year's report. So when we look at IT related errors, this is an overview. You can see there were 374 when we include entity, just shy of 400, and by far the biggest chunk is where specific requirements weren't met, and that tended to be things like failure to use logic rules that are built into the LIMS. Either the warning flag wasn't updated when the lab were informed that somebody needed irradiated or something like that, or the flag was in place but it was overridden. We also look at right blood, right patient as well. That's another big chunk. So where it's tended to be where a patient's identification is there's been errors. So either failure to consult the historical record, the sample didn't match the IT system, but nobody noticed. And that I was going to say that also included errors to do with electronic blood management as well. So it tended to be like collection of units where the ID didn't match. Okay, so case number 1. We've got a nurse collecting a unit of platelets for patient A using electronic collection. Good so far. The platelets were intended for patient B, but unfortunately they had the same surname and they were on the same ward. So unfortunately the person collecting the units selected the wrong units out of the platelet agitator. And the IT, as they came to use the IT tracker, it generated an alert, which is absolutely excellent. But unfortunately, at this point, it said contact the lab for help. So they contacted the lab for help, and the BMS said that's okay to use, in error. It was taken to the ward, but when they get there, the patient has spiked temperature. So it's brought back to the agitator by the lab, and it's returned. There is another error alert on the tracker to say that there's something wrong, because this unit shouldn't have been taken in the first place. So at this point, it's saying, please contact the lab. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So a few hours later, the unit is, somebody comes back down to collect the unit for the final time. And at this point, there is an alert that says stop, contact blood bank. It's had multiple alerts, and they haven't been actioned or cleared in the lab. So it's saying at this point, absolutely stop. So it says stop, contact blood bank. So that the person collecting the unit contacts the lab again, and unfortunately the lab say again that this unit is okay to continue with collection, obviously again in error. There's no bedside IT available in this trust, but there were 2 independent checks, but the error is not detected. So unfortunately, the patient A received units of platelets that were issued for patient B. So really, to summarise this case, the IT was available. There were alerts set in, which is excellent, but they weren't actioned. It absolutely relied on humans, me, understanding the alerts and actioning them appropriately, which didn't happen in this case. There was no patient harm associated with this case, thankfully, but it could have been very different. So it's absolutely making sure where you've got alerts that they are understandable, and that the person actioning them understands the serious nature of them, and that when they are actioned, that it's actioned appropriately. Because to be fair, the clinical area did follow the process. Unfortunately, the lab did not in this instance. Okay, case number 2. We've got a nurse collects 2 units at the same time, one for patient A, who's group A, and one for patient B, who's group B. The nurse puts both of the units on a trolley at the patient's bedside, and absolutely uses the electronic tracking system correctly. So they scan the unit, and they scan the patient, they scan themselves, and they do everything correctly. They spike the unit, but unfortunately they connect the other unit in error. It's noticed immediately, and there's no reaction in the patient, but this was an ABO incompatibility. We're giving a B to an A here at this point. So again, luckily there was no reaction in the patient, and the IT was used correctly, but there was just that error administration. So for me, it leads to the question, did the use of the IT build confidence and slight complacency that everything would be okay? Again, it relied on humans making the final choice of which unit should I give, because the IT system is assuming that all the previous steps have been made correctly. So really in a hospital, and it may be not the case in all hospitals, but certainly in the hospitals I've worked in, you didn't collect 2 units for 2 people at the same time. So the IT is reliant on the fact that those processes have been carried out correctly, and unfortunately they weren't. But again, thankfully, no reaction in this patient. Tracker downtime is case number 3. Okay, so patient A is transfused with red cells intended for patient B. Okay, so how did we get there? So the nurse collected the unit correctly for patient A, but at the point of being at the patient's bedside, the tracker lost power, and they couldn't do they couldn't complete the whole process. So there was no, they couldn't use the IT system for the full check. So the nurse didn't follow any downtime procedures and continued to check the unit without a second checker. Unfortunately, so that led to an ABO incompatible again. So the next shift nurse noticed the wrong patient details on the unit and the transfusion was stopped. Oh no, sorry, this case they weren't ABO, they were both O, and there were no red cell antibodies. So again, there was no harm in this patient. But again, like we were saying before, this easily could have been an ABO incompatibility. So in this case, there was hardware available, but it just wasn't used correctly. And I think it showed that, again, a little bit over reliance on the IT system. The IT system will always be there and it will always be available. But when it's not available, it's just making sure you've got really clear downtime procedures. And obviously, why did the tracker lose power? Is there a process for charging up those units and having them on a recycled system, making sure that it's always available? But equally, when there is a downtime, have you got a robust system in place? Okay, so this one is about unclear alerts. So patient A required a unit of platelets and it's ordered on the electronic system, so by the clinical team. Prior to admission, unfortunately, the patient's surname is amended on the EPR, but there's no interoperability, so there's no connection between the EPR and the lab IT system. So there's discrepancy between the two systems about the patient's identification. And the platelets, therefore, are issued with the incorrect patient details on. And the tracker did detect a discrepancy between the wristband and the unit. And the nurse tried 3 times to scan because the alert that was popping up, she just didn't understand what it was saying and didn't understand what she was required to do. So just kept going through the motions and trying to scan it again. The nurse in this instance contacted the lab, who identified the error, and they were able to relabel the unit. But when we look at this, there's a multitude of things here, isn't there? There's a lack of interoperability between the two systems, which would have rectified the issue in the first place. The alerts were in place, but the person reading the alerts had no idea what they were trying to tell them. So I think we just need, again, this is also to do with alerts, but just need to make sure that they're understandable if it pops up. Do I understand the difference between a simple error and a major catastrophe error? Do we have different levels of errors? Is it understandable who the error is trying to tell and what they're trying to tell them to do? Again, there was a little bit of over-reliance on the IT because this was the unit was checked at the bedside. They could have looked at the wristband and the ticket on the unit of platelets, and hopefully they would have detected the error again. So it's just making sure that staff are aware of what the alerts are and where they're most appropriate. I think this might be my last one. So we've got patient A requiring a unit of red cells. They required K, neg, and irradiated. So there were 2 flags on the limb system to do with specific requirements. And the BMS have been there many times on a night shift, on a late shift. You're issuing units and you're rushing at the end of the day because you want to use the short dated stock. So you've kind of got your button stuck on, I need to get rid of this expiring stock. The BMS selected K-neg, but unfortunately missed the irradiated requirement. And when the alert popped up to say you've not met this requirement, they were so focused on it being K-neg and short dated that they just escaped through those alerts, unfortunately, and went on to issue non-irradiated units. And thankfully, in this instance, the error was detected at the bedside. So this is most certainly a case of cognitive bias. So I'm making an assumption when one of my alerts pops up, I'm already made an assumption that it's to do with one thing and it's actually to do with something else. And unfortunately, in shock reported cases, we do see that a lot. So it's trying to make sure that staff are aware that they can have bias and that if those alerts popping up, they really read them. But again, it feeds back into, is the alert clear enough to understand, and does it give me a clear action of what I need to do? And I can absolutely see this is an easy mistake to make, unfortunately. Okay, so I'm nearly at my half an hour. So lessons learnt. So IT can be really helpful. Absolutely transforms the way in my 20 years of being a BMS. it's absolutely changed the way the labs work, and it vastly improved the transfusion safety, but it really needs to be set up correctly to make sure that that enables staff to use those systems correctly. And IT can absolutely answer some of your errors and some concerns and some issues, but with it, it will also ask other ones. So don't over rely on implementing a new IT system that it will solve all your problems, because unfortunately it will bring with it a new set of problems. IT fatigue, alert fatigue and cognitive bias and over reliance on IT. We do see that certainly alert fatigue, just too many alerts, and they're not clear to what they're actually being asked to do. Having expert support is just so important, but having been there myself, you tend to have insufficient numbers on that, and that IT support tended to be across multiple different groups. It might be across the whole of diagnostics, so it might be across the whole of pathology. It certainly wasn't just for transfusion, and we have such a it's moving my pages on, I'm ever so sorry. And we have such specific needs in transfusion. It's really important to get that expert support. Like we've talked about, alerts must be understandable and actionable. Absolutely. Otherwise, they're really not worth the paper they're written on it to some extent. Staff need to be able to understand what they're asking, what the alert is asking them to do. Maximise the interoperability between systems wherever possible, and that sometimes isn't within your realms, but absolutely bring that up wherever you possibly can to talk to other systems. And IT will fail at some point, because it just does, and making sure you have really robust contingency plans for those downtimes, just to minimise errors and maximise the continuation of your service, is really important. Another document that SHOT are about to release is, we've taken the 10 steps in transfusion, which the rainbow coloured diagram, and all the way from requesting all the way to administration. And we've looked at each of those points and thought, how could you use IT in that practice? And then we've tried to make it a bit like a way to help you write a business case. So hopefully you can maximise the use of that document, and that should be out in the next couple of months. I think we're hoping to have it available on the website, but we will certainly promote that when it's finalised. There's loads of resources on the SHOT website. If you can't find something, or you think we might have it and you really can't find it on the website, absolutely get in touch. There's all sorts of SHOT bites, which are like 2 sides of A4 that cover different topics, but we've certainly got one on IT. We do different webinars, and there's the SHOT app as well. If you wanted to download the app, everything that's available on the website is all available on there. And a little bit of self-promotion, I'm ever so sorry. We do have our annual symposium coming up in July. We are at the Etihad. It's a fantastic venue. It's just, even if you're not interested in football, it is a fantastic venue. And we've really thought differently this year about how to make it a bit more relatable, and we're talking about interesting cases that we've had throughout the year to really try and cement that learning. So that's me. There's Vicky and Nikki. We're both lab incident specialists, but I'm sure you've met Si as well. He's the clinical side. If you've got any questions, you can absolutely get in touch, or you could email the main SHOT website. We'd love to hear from you. If you've got any documents you think would be helpful to somebody else, please do send them our way. It would be brilliant.